Hello and welcome. My name is Betsy Reed, and I am the US editor of The Guardian, which means I am responsible for our coverage of everything that happens in the US, which has been interesting lately, to say the least. And I'm here with Ayşe Zarakol, who is a professor of international relations at the University of Cambridge. The main themes of her research are East-West relations and social hierarchies in world politics, problems of modernity and sovereignty, and rising and declining powers. She is the author of Before the West, The Rise and Fall of Eastern World Orders, which has won many prestigious awards. And in 2024, she was elected to fellowship in the British Academy and the Academia Europaea. She also has a forthcoming book that looks at the global history of strongmen, which she says she conceived of before the rise of Trump in the US. I'm sure we'll get into that. And I'd just like to start with the kind of question of the moment, which is the disorder of our times unprecedented? Many have argued that this is an age of polycrisis, that we face an unprecedented coming together of multiple overlapping crises, the rise of generative AI, climate catastrophe, and now Trump, who's sort of, running roughshod over every democratic norm in the US, has certainly taken many of us at home by surprise and left us in a sort of state of shock. It's not something I think anyone really anticipated, and so therefore, I can understand why there would be this idea that this is somehow unprecedented. But I'll turn it to you, Ayşe, to challenge that notion.
Thank you. So I also understand the tendency to see our times as unprecedented. There's so much going on, from climate change to AI to this global trend of strongmen now having reached the West. It does seem, the arguments for polycrisis or the idea that we're living through unprecedented times, it does emotionally resonate, I think, with all of us. At the same time, I think we have to check this tendency because as human beings, we're all a little bit, I think, self-centered, and we have a tendency to imagine that things that are happening to us are especially unique, without parallel, and we are suffering more than our predecessors. And historically, that's just, I don't think, true. While history does not repeat itself exactly, I think we can find in different historical periods precedents that we can think with about what possible outcomes may be from our current moment. On the plane here, because I was coming to Vienna, I was rereading The World of Yesterday by Stefan Zweig, and just the opening of the book where he's talking about my generation has lived through unprecedented times. There's, so much upheaval. It's so different from, my grandparents and father's generation. It's a particularly bleak moment, and obviously that moment in the 20th century is a place that we may look for analogies, and you do see that to the extent that people see possible historical analogs, they do look at the 20th century, the interwar period. But I'm overseeing now a multi-year project to work with historians to see, are there other, besides the 20th century, are there other possible analogs? And the other two periods that we've looked at, in addition to the 20th century, one is the 19th century, which is a stable period relatively for Europe, but it's a period of upheaval for the rest of the world because of imperial competition. So maybe there are lessons to be learned from the 19th century and the behavior of empires at that period. And yet another potential comparison moment is the 17th century, and that comes from my recent work, my book Before the West, which ends in the 17th century. Again, we don't think of the 17th century very much, although maybe in Vienna people do, but that's a moment, 17th century was a period of a lot of upheavals. Of course, in European history, we know 30 Years' War, but across Eurasia, there were many wars, rebellions. Now, one of the working hypotheses as to why is because of climate change. It's a period of a lot of scientific progress or change as well, and of course, it's the period of that we associate with absolutism, which are kind of the historical predecessors of our present-day strongmen. So I think there are also potential parallels in the 17th century as well. Why is it helpful to look at history for these potential analogies, parallels? Because I think it kind of opens up our imagination as to what is possible. The 20th century analogy is scary, but at the same time, especially maybe for the West, it's comforting because after the period of the interwar period and after war comes order, a global order. It comes international law, comes international institutions, comes the social welfare state and all of that. So maybe that's a comforting analogy. The 17th century analogy is maybe not so comforting because that's almost a century of disorder, and it's also the moment maybe the center of gravity globally shifts from east to west. So what can we learn from that? But I think as unprecedented as our times feel, there are lessons to be learned from different historical periods.
And I wonder if Trump's systematic attack and dismantling of liberal institutions and the liberal international order and all of the pressure that it's under now, I mean, when you mentioned the period of imperial competition in the 17th century, in a way, he has brought back some ideas that had been thoroughly discredited about, the sort of moral righteousness of might makes right. And
yeah.
Does that make it more compelling to look to that period as opposed to the 20th century?
So, the real moment for comparison for that kind of imperial competition, I can do whatever I want. Of course, there are many historical periods where that's true, but the most recent, maybe, is end of the 19th century. That kind of imperial competition, how it was experienced outside of Europe, and you do see this. It's not just Trump, of course, Putin. That this kind of imperial behavior, and there's talk that China might get into it as well with Taiwan. So that's definitely one possible scenario. I think where that analogy starts breaking down is the rest of the world. In the 19th century. I would argue that there is a greater power and economic differential between European empires and then the rest of the world. Whereas, we are also, in addition to everything else that we've mentioned, the 21st century is often discussed as a moment where the global south, the so-called global south, is asserting itself, and those at the receiving end are not so much without agency. They have more self-confidence, more economic power, maybe more military power. And I think that complicates this idea of reading the 21st century just as imperial competition as it was in the 19th.
You've noted that that there's a sort of relative paucity of a compelling vision of the future now, which perhaps stems in part from the claim that this is entirely unprecedented. I mean, what do you think? Looking at it from a global perspective, why is there that paucity of thought, and what are the consequences of that?
Yes, so I wrote a short piece for the Ideas letter comparing our moment with the 1990s, contrasting, I guess. Because in the 1990s, there were future-based projections. We associate the 1990s with figures like Fukuyama and Huntington, and they are projecting some, with some optimism. We can debate their projections, but there are forward-looking projections about what's next. And I think in our one of the problems that we face now, I think especially in the West or the global North, is there's this kind of lack of imagination as to what may come after. We tend to assume things will go back to the status quo, or we use this 20th century analogy, right, that this kind of order will reconstitute itself. And I think that lack of forward thinking, that lack of the ability to future project ourselves into kind of a new 21st century is one of the problems that we face. But I think it's a problem specific maybe to the West, or the West is experiencing that maybe for the first time in a long time, not being able to predict or plan for the future. And I see it also, not just in thinkers, but also the students I teach at Cambridge. There's a lot of criticism of what is happening, and there's a lot of criticism of what we used to have, what we in international relations call the liberal international order, but there is no kind of a future vision as to what should come after. Maybe it's different here, but I think that it's a kind of a general trend.
Would you say that that's true of mostly the world of liberal thinkers? Because, there is sort of, emergence of these techno-futurists who have a particular vision of the future, and then on the right and the far right, there's everything from, apocalyptic visions of rapture to a kind of vision of the future that's rooted in this intense nostalgia in the past. So how, looking at those sort of more popular ideas of the future, how does that relate to, and maybe that makes it all the more important that there is a more compelling answer that comes from academia? Yes,
I do think the right is perhaps slightly ahead of the left or the liberal side in terms of trying to come up with a new language that is also an old language. Again, I'm not sure how innovative some of the proposals for the various kind of authoritarian. It's in some ways they're trying to go back to a much older period. But they are, in terms of offering some kind of solution, I think they are ahead of the other side of the aisle, and which is why, globally they're doing better now. Yeah.
If you don't mind talking about Trump's America for a minute, people frequently draw analogies to, Weimar Germany and 1920s in Italy. What do you think are the most relevant analogies to explain the contemporary U.S.? And I just wanted to note in that context, it's interesting to me that Trump himself has fiercely rejected any comparison to Nazism, and in fact has threatened to criminalize the very assertion of that analogy, saying that it is directly responsible for some of the political violence that's gone on. So it's a really interesting atmosphere in which to discuss that analogy. So I wonder what you make of that, both, how compelling is it, and what is the sort of utility of making that comparison in the US?
Again, I mean, I think it's a comparison that has emotional resonance. It's a period that we are most familiar with, or we know through books and movies and all that. And it does have this ability to like alert people to, oh, something dangerous is happening. But I think again, the 20th century or the Nazi analogy also obscures something that is happening in the 21st century. And here, not everybody will agree with me, but I think I mean, whether we're talking about Trump or the other strong men in the 21st century, like Putin or Erdogan, or there are many of them now, pretty much everywhere in the world, and that is compared to their 20th century predecessors. These strong men we have are much less ideological. They are much less bound by ideology or the notion of a larger cause. They sometimes use the language of 20th century ideologies, or even religion, or various symbols of the nation. But they are much more about themselves. It's about their person. So I think something different is going on than Nazism, which was terrible in its own way. But again, this global trend is, I think, about the personalization of the state in service of one man. I think it's almost always a man, sometimes also his family, and personalization of both state domestically. Everything becomes kind of almost the property of that one person. Personalization of international relations, so foreign policy is not about what's good up for the country, but it's about what's good for Trump, what's good for Erdogan. And that is something very old. It's not very 20th century. Again, it's maybe 16th, 17th century. Maybe it's antiquity. So it is. It's something very old. It seems to be coming back in the 21st century if we cannot stem this tide of strong men. Because modernity was kind of our globally it was our move away from personalized sovereignty, it's personalized states. It was about this depersonalization of the state, depersonalization of state institutions, creation of bureaucracies, the idea that the state represents the people, and now we are going back. It's all about individual rulers.
And so what do you think is driving that? Like, why has there been this shift to personalization? And then how can there be another kind of counter revolution akin to modernity?
I think this is kind of like a very old problem. I think this type of personalization of the state is something that, again, as I was saying, has a very long history. You see it over and over again. It's kind of like the default political problem. If there are no checks or constraints, this is kind of the outcome of politics. We've, much earlier on, we found kind of a check on it, which is religion. Especially monotheistic religions constrain the idea of one person can decide everything, because if there is a God, then you cannot be as an individual God on earth, right? So that was an initial solution. That we kind of lost that constraint. Then we found a new solution, the modern solution: democracy, constitutions, the idea of individual rights, all the modern ideologies with their emphasis on the people. And it's because those modern solutions that we found, they have eroded. The 20th century solutions have lost their legitimacy, and with them, all the modern ideologies are losing their force. So then we have, I think, the return of this very old problem, which is concentration of power and authority in the hands of single individuals. Yeah.
What do you see as the role of rising social inequality in that process of,
Yes.
eroding the legitimacy of democratic institutions, paving the way for this rise of strongmen?
Rising social inequality is a great contributor to this process. I mean, this is why the institutions are losing their legitimacy. The problem is once strongmen emerge, and initially they often offer solutions, but they kind of entrench inequality because they make it all about my supporters versus everybody else. So then there is this, both polarization and then those who are trying to get in with the strong man and his house and his network and his family, and then everybody else who's left out in the cold. They are very unequal regimes. So they're both, I think, a product of inequality, and we do see them proliferate after periods of global connectivity, that increase these inequalities. But then they also entrench them. They're also a cause of inequality everywhere they pop up.
So then does it follow from that some attempt to meaningfully address inequality has to follow for, a new era to emerge?
Yeah. I think what we need is a new language for, and again, I don't know where this is going to come from, but I mean, if history is a guide, what we need is a new language for why the regular people, the common people matter. As I said, initially that argument was made by various world religions. Later, in modernity, we found other ways of making that argument, why the regular people, the common people matters, why the lowest in society still deserves respect and dignity. But as old arguments break down, we need a new language, new kind of ideology, new way of saying why do the regular people matter? Why shouldn't one person have all the power?
In your book, you wrote quite a bit about the sort of, Western hubris in our analysis of, the rise of the West and the sort of refusal to engage with the East in terms of looking for analogies that might enlighten us. Can you speak a bit about that?
Hubris. So my issue was my discipline, my background is in international relations. That's my field, and for the longest time, international relations, we cannot really conduct experiments and so on. I mean, even though some of my colleagues do. What we do is look at history, but the history we were looking at to understand international relations and draw lessons from was history from the 17th century onward, from Peace of Westphalia until now. It's an important history, but it's a limited history, right? So what I was trying to argue in the book is that we need to look beyond 17th century and look beyond Europe, because if you're interested in empires, world politics, concept of sovereignty, what is a state? There's so much more human history. So in the book, as I've referred to already, my book starts in the 13th century with the Mongols and then ends in the 17th century with the Habsburgs, you could say. So it's a history that starts in Asia and then comes to Europe. And only by studying different periods of history can we, if to the extent that there are any patterns to be found, any kind of generalizations about what does it mean, how do we understand world orders or behavior of great powers or empires? We need more data.
Going back to just sort of what's going on right now with the liberal international order under enormous strain and perhaps collapsing. I mean, could you speak about what you see as coming next? If I know that you feel that there aren't enough credible theories as to that, but
yes. So at Cambridge, I teach, for some years I've been teaching this module, The Crisis of the Liberal International Order, and I teach this module in January, February. And last year I was teaching this module. Of course, Trump was, Trump was in office, and he had the infamous press conference with Zelensky. And after that, I went to lecture, and I said, I can't talk about the crisis of the liberal international order because I think future historians are going to look at this date and say this is like, a time of death of the liberal. Maybe hyperbolic, but I do think we are past the point of talking about the crisis of the liberal international order. I mean, of course, liberal international order to some extent was always a fiction, but it was at least an aspiration. And it was an understanding, at least between United States and its allies. But I think all of that has broken down. International law, for the most part, has lost, to the extent that it had any enforceability. Of course, some of the institutions live on, and they will live on, and they will be repurposed. But that, again, benchmark dates, very tricky stuff for historians, but that period of the liberal international order, which we could either date back to end of World War II or at least the end of the Cold War, I think we're at the end of that period very clearly. And I will add to this, I think Europe is the least prepared for this outcome, because the rest of the world already had a lot of bad experiences with the liberal international order, never fully bought into it, never really, was always a bit suspicious of it. But I think European countries in general were the most enthusiastic participants of the liberal international order, to some extent even more than the US. Mm-hmm. And they are not, I think most European governments, elites, or populations are not either actually ready or psychologically ready for a world where this order doesn't exist. So I think the greatest catching up with this new brave new world we're in has to be done in Europe.
I mean, do you see then the sort of decline in global influence of the former liberal international order of the West? I mean, in the US, you've seen the destruction of USAID and basically any kind of attempt to, exert soft power around the world. So, I mean, how does that change the sort of balance of power? The soft power is. I mean, it's not just USAID in general. There's always been a complaint about Western hypocrisy, double standards, and so on. But now they are kind of received wisdom. It's not just a complaint. I mean, people just don't think the West is abiding by, especially the US is. When you have Trump coming out in support of various other strongmen or dictators, it's just we can't really speak of the influence of U.S. version or the previous version of liberalism having any kind of soft power. There's this global trend of strongmen. I mean, that seems to be kind of the norm, like the new. There was always, for much of the last century, there was a push for countries to democratize, to liberalize, even if they weren't doing it, to act like they were doing it. The kind of the standard internationally was you have to become a democracy eventually. This is the expectation, this is the norm. Now we seem to be in a world where the opposite is true. It's almost, in Trump's America. I mean, it's not just Trump, right? Of course, you have three great powers. Russia, well, we can debate whether Russia is an actual great power, but China, US, and Russia, they're all ruled by
strongman type figures, authoritarian. So if you're like a country, a smaller country that's kind of where the forces of democracy are fighting with the forces of authoritarianism, actually it's the authoritarian side that has now the upper hand, you know, because it's probably be more advantageous for you to produce your own strongman so that they can go to Washington and make personal deals with with Trump, because as I was saying, this is a personalization of international relations. There's no more respect for ministries of foreign affairs. It's more about, do you know Trump? Does your son golf with Trump's son? Or that sort of stuff is becoming more important. So the international pressure to democratize and liberalize has gone, and now we have almost the opposite pressure, which is very depressing. But we have to face facts.
So, I mean, in that context, I mean, Trump is widely regarded in the U.S. as being incredibly hypocritical, on matters of international law, but there still are some institutions that exist, and I mean, is it not even worth kind of leveling those charges of hypocrisy? I mean, it feels like that's one of the few levers still available, and that there are still some, living democratic institutions internationally.
Is it useful to level charges of hypocrisy against Trump? I'm not sure. It may still be useful to level charges of hypocrisy against, maybe the United States, because of course there are people who care about this stuff in the United States. It's not like, I'm talking in this very kind of depressing way, but I do also want to acknowledge that there are many forces around the world that are still fighting for democracy and liberalism and so on. So, and we have to keep going. We have to keep pushing, hoping that it will make a difference. So we cannot just give up. So in that sense, yes, maybe. But for figures like Trump, these strongmen, the hypocrisy charge doesn't work. Hypocrisy charge works on liberals, who actually, they have to do ugly stuff, but they actually have certain values that they internalized, and therefore, if you say you're a hypocrite to a liberal, it hurts them. They want to do better, and that's why the liberal international order, for all its faults, over the many decades it existed, it became more inclusive and more open because the charges of hypocrisy worked very slowly over time, the pushback from the global south and so on, which I do also recognize. So there was progress because people were sensitive to the charges of hypocrisy. But for Trump, you can't say to Trump or Erdogan, you're a hypocrite. They changed their positions overnight because they can, and they're not hurt by the accusation of hypocrisy. It's just, I thought that back then, now this is what I think now, and they are able to bring their supporters along because it's about the person. It's not about an ideology or some kind of consistent set of values. It's about worship of that person.
I mean, we've seen some pretty radical changes overnight in the U.S., but I mean, isn't it possible to imagine things shifting back? I mean, you saw Lula coming to power post-Bolsonaro, and I think that is an interesting kind of analogy, the way those two movements have interacted in Brazil. I mean, isn't it possible to imagine, especially if there's some sort of cataclysmic economic event or something that, like the pandemic did actually after his first term.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that there is a possibility of real change in a different direction still.
Yeah, of course it's possible. I think, again, history is always open-ended. There's a lot of contingency. I would never say there's only one possible outcome out of any scenario. But the reason why, again, and Trump has been in power, his second term started not even a year ago, so we could say all of this is very premature, they're the midterms and all of that. The difficulty is the speed with which Trump is moving and doing, I think, lasting damage to all institutions in the United States and also international institutions. And the fact that he's facing less resistance in the US than many of his counterparts around the world faced in trying to centralize and personalize power. That's been the most surprising to me about Trump. Not what he's doing, because what he's doing is out of a playbook. There are many, many examples around the world going after universities, getting the support of the higher courts, all of that, or redecorating the White House in the style he has, all of that has precedence. But the fact that there's very little pushback, that's been surprising to me. I would have expected more. Maybe it is coming, and maybe that's, maybe people haven't yet processed what is happening. So that's one worry, I think. The other worry is, even if there is some kind of cataclysmic event, as you say, like the pandemic that pushes Trump out of power, or Trump dies, he's not very young, so he could pass away from natural causes or something. But it doesn't fix the problem. Right now, the strongman, it's a structural, it's a global trend. Something about the way our order has worked has been eroded, like the setting on which we construct our politics. It's turned to quicksand. So Trump goes, United States could produce another Trump-like figure. He is kind of a symptom of a global trend, especially because the opposition doesn't seem to have any kind of solutions or answers, an argument as to why regular people matter, as I was saying, or even, the left could produce a strongman too. There are strongmen that come from the left, right? Because what's called the left. Until we find a new argument for how we do politics and how we create international order, I think we're going to see more and more strongmen. It's not just about Trump or any of these figures. Like we've already mentioned, tech bros and their techno-futurism. We could have tech bro strongman. We could see a bigger convergence. I mean, we're already starting to see this with Elon Musk interference in politics and so on. But in the next decades, they could actually take charge of states, and we could see tech bro, like the next generation of strongmen may not be produced from actual politics. And they may do less lip service to nation and the flag and all that, and they may be just about, it's me, my company. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like sci-fi, but we may be getting there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when you were talking about how something about the order has eroded, allowing, increasing this personalization of power, what is the role of technology, do you believe, in all of that? And the sort of advent of social media, the atomization of society, the fragmentation of news, and the proliferation of all of these different platforms where people receive a very different version of the facts that define their own individual worldview.
Yes. I think atomization is definitely a factor. Social media is definitely a factor in undermining existing institutions. Also, again, one parallel with the world of yesterday, I'm sorry, it's because of the location, it's in my mind. He was talking about how his generation's exposed to events around the world like no other generation were, and they kind of feel everything that's going on globally. They're kind of feeling it. And I think what we're living through is that times a million, right? We are immediately aware of all that is terrible around the world. That's what our connectivity does to us. But then we can't do anything about it. So we are both hyper-aware and really lacking any type of sense of agency in ourselves. Like, what can you do? You tweet, I will boycott this brand, or there's very little we can do. So that feeling of not being able to feel like actors or agents ourselves, I think among some people that is That is what's causing this following the strong leader, because you feel small. So how do you kind of get out of that feeling of small? You identify with somebody who creates the illusion of power. I mean, strongmen are not really strong in a way. I mean, we give them power, but they kind of it's the simulation of of power. So some of us, I think, deal with that atomization, that lack of agency, that feeling of powerlessness by choosing that type of politics.
Right. I mean, of course, at the same time, that connectivity and the knowledge of what's going on in Gaza, for example, did give rise to, a student movement, but that has been systematically crushed, and dissent in that way has been essentially criminalized in the U.S. So that, kind of forecloses that avenue.
Yes. So there are protests, and at the same time, it's again the cause-effect chain is also very broken. I mean, even when you're able to protest, it's so far removed from being a solution to that event that you're every day being exposed to, and of course, So I think even among protesters, there's a sense of feeling of lack of agency, like helplessness. Like I think we all feel it, and some feel it more. And I'm not saying everybody, we all support strongmen, but some turn to that.
I mean, boycotts are still being used, but they're also being criminalized now in the U.S. So, okay, it's time for questions. A few minutes left. Right there. Do we have a mic? Sorry.
Thank you for the presentation. I have a question on when you said we are hyper-connected on everything that's too bad. I think it's so true. It makes us feel completely impotent on taking any action. How much can the media, like the classic media, not the social media, but like The Guardian, for instance, how much can these media do to help take some agency?
Maybe that's a question for you. Are we gathering questions, or should I go one?
I think we should just go back and forth, if that's okay. I mean, I'll speak to that. I mean, I do feel that institutions like The Guardian and other major newspapers have a big role to play in not having people consume a single source, a single feed of information that is programmed by an algorithm that's totally opaque, but rather present what we believe to be the most critical stories of the moment in the context we believe they should be, presented in, so that we have more of a collective sense of knowledge of what's going on. So I think that is still an important role of the so-called legacy media.
Yeah, I mean, we have to keep legacy media alive, because also, I mean, the other thing that's going on is the internet, I mean, it's well observed. It's not what it used to be 10 years ago. It's like there's also the fragmentation of the internet and people's ability to find information, maybe AI. So I think people will still want, or at least some people will still want, trusted, reliable sources, and we will understand the value of Guardian, New York Times, all of that more maybe in the next decade. I don't think, they're out.
There.
No, lots of questions.
questions.
You pick.
Well, I had called on that person in the middle.
Thank you very much for sharing your insights with us. I want to ask you a small combo of meta questions about international relations as a discipline. And looping back to what you said about IR being derived more or less from history and also failure of imagination that is experiencing, I want to ask you, what would you say is explanatory power of mainstream IR for here and now? And secondly, what would be the predictive power of IR, given that you said that there's a little bit of failure of imagination? And what paradigms, school of thoughts you find most potent for explaining and predicting, if any? And since you are very much into exploring alternatives, I want to, if there is time, to ask you how would you comment on the fact that it's Anglo-generated discourse absolutely dominates the IR, and also that it's heavily economized, as economization by Chicago-style economics is also very much present. So could it be that this failure of imagination stems from the fact that it's very, one could say, mono perspective?
Yeah. That's a lot of questions, and I know others are waiting, so I'll just answer briefly. I think, in general, the discipline of international relations is not good with explaining change. It's not good at explaining the 21st century. It's a very 20th century oriented discipline. It takes the 20th century stuff for granted and has assumed that international relations always works like that and will always work like that. So it's a discipline very much in need of a rethink, I think, along with economics and maybe some of the other social sciences. The advantage I think international relations has as a field, it draws from it draws from history, sociology, so it could actually, it could bring together theories from other disciplines to make sense of where we're headed globally. So it has the potential, I don't think it has the ability. Is my answer, but maybe we can talk later. Yeah.
There.
Thank you for your talk. It's kind of funny to see you here in Vienna because I've also been in the history faculty at Cambridge, just finishing my PhD, so then not having bumped into you there. And anyway. I just wanted to press you on when you said that Europe is the least prepared for this end of the liberal international order, whatever that was, and we need to catch up. I just wanted to press you on, what does that actually mean in your opinion? Should we be fighting to the death to defend our liberal democratic project, or kind of playing by these new rules of the new order that you were talking about? What did you mean when you say we need to catch up?
Yeah. Well, I mean, some of the catching up is already happening thanks to Trump. I mean, this. It's kind of a mentality adjustment. I mean, I think Europe. There are lots of great things about. I criticize Eurocentrism and so on, but there are lots of great things about Europe. What's been achieved here in terms of democracy and citizenship rights, economically, and all that. And I think some of that could be preserved, even in a world of strong men. Europe doesn't necessarily have to be part of that trend. I mean, maybe not everywhere in Europe, because there are also potential problematic sites here as well, but much of it could be preserved. But what Europe needs to do is snap out of this 20th century kind of mentality that we will easily or quickly go back to 20th century stuff. International order will quickly reconstitute itself. This is just kind of like some rough times now, but in a few years things will go back to status quo. I don't think that's going to happen. The US-Europe relationship is going to be very different, I think, from now on. And everybody needs to be kind of planning for that. It has to be more of a defensive posture, as opposed to assuming Europe is at the center of the international order and we have this very reliable partner in the US. None of those things are true anymore. So defensive posture, I don't mean like increase defense spending. It's more of a mentality switch. It's more of a, how do I survive in a world? I mean, and other regions had to think about that. That doesn't center me and my style of politics. And I think that's the realization everybody needs to come to.
Thank you very much. Very interesting analysis, and I could only agree with it. But there is another change taking place simultaneously, which will also prevent that we will go back to what was, and that is climate change. Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting that most of the strong men, China may be a little bit different, but only a little bit, do not want adaptation to climate change. Mm-hmm. They're rejecting it. So how do you explain this? Because it will come, it will come, it's there. And it will have an enormous impact. All the forecasts from all relevant scientific institutions say it's going much faster than we thought, and it will have an impact on the everyday life and also on the strongman.
Yeah. I think yes, I mean, China is a little bit different because even though Xi is more of a strongman than his predecessors, the institutions, weirdly in China, have more continuity with the 20th century. Like they've been less disrupted compared to other places. So there is still more of a, state kind of, despite the increased personalization, there is still some degree of 20th century politics at work in China. So thinking about, future of China, future of the Chinese people, and so on. The problem with the other strongman, I mean, the more personalized they see politics, the less they're concerned, I think, about climate change. Because it's not about, how do we save the planet, or it's not even how do I save my country, my people. It's more about, how do I, buy support, and it's very short-term kind of, you make the right moves, you get some cronies, and they support you. You don't have to help everybody, or you don't have to make sure that American children or that they grow up in a world where there's breathable air, or where things are not flooding. It's more about what your supporters want now, what you can make money off now. And yeah, so it's exactly the wrong kind of politics for this moment. But that's what we are facing, and that's why we again urgently need a new kind of political language as to why regular people and their children and their grandchildren matter, and it's not just about these individuals. But again, I say that, I don't know where it's going to come from, but it will. I think if history is a guide, it will come, because we've always come up with arguments for why the regular people matter. But it's not, we don't have it yet, unfortunately.
Maybe try a question in the back there. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm going to establish short eye contact with you, but otherwise I need to read it out from my phone. I want to ask, if we establish that the times are not in fact strictly unprecedented, can you please share what were the precedents for establishing the democratic balance again? What can we learn from the past experiences, maybe especially from the 17th century, and if possible, with examples from the European region, not going back to USA again?
Sorry, some of that I couldn't make out, but so what can we learn from history as to
Yeah,
How?
we're talking about how, my voice is quite loud. Yeah, so if the times are not unprecedented, what were the precedents for establishing the democratic balance? So, for example, tackling the problems similar to what we see today, erosion of political systems, loss of agency, small people's problems that just do not get solved solely by identifying with a strong authority figure.
Yeah.
And European
It's a big question. It's a difficult one. And I guess I'll answer in a similar way to the previous question. What I take from history is this idea of not losing hope. I mean, that's why I embarked on this. This project is the disorder of our times unprecedented, and there are periods of real terrible disorder, right? I mean, again, the 17th century being one of them. Decades and decades of unsettled politics, war, famines, all sorts of stuff, and climate change. But order does re-emerge, and I think when you go, maybe it's not that fun to be living through these times, but we need to know that people before us has faced similar or worse, and were able to reconstitute both order, but also, able to produce, great art and other sorts of things, from suffering. I mean, that's what the ancient Greeks say, right? Like, no life without suffering, and from suffering comes also also beauty. So again, maybe I don't know what you'll make of that answer. I don't have a clear formula of this is how we get back democratic politics. All I know is that we cannot give up and we need to keep going because eventually there will be something positive. And it just depends on people living through difficult times to keep it going. I mean, that's what our predecessors did.
Thank you very much. And I find it extremely interesting because on one level, we have personalized power without God. On the other, most of the strong men are elected men.
Are elected.
Yeah. They're not looking up, they're looking down.
Yeah.
So from this point of view, you're going to have a strong man who do not have also an argument for creating dynasty, which was one of the ways of stabilizing the regimes.
Yes.
I'm very much interested in two questions. To what extent the fact that you're going to have leaders who are going to live probably much longer than we used to live? And secondly, to what extent the fact that you have basically major population changes in which you cannot define society and population as you know it. For example, having societies in which 30% of the people living in a democratic state cannot vote in this country and so on, is not also one of the arguments and one of the preconditions for the rise of a personalized power, regardless of the fact that you have elections all the time.
Okay. Could you repeat the second part?
My second part is you have a major changes of population.
Yeah.
And you have a democracies. And you have a situation in which basically 15% of the people on the labor market cannot vote.
Yeah.
10% of the people who have the right to vote are not living in the country, so they're not paying taxes and so on. So this creates a problem. Who are the people? We don't have this stable settlement that was so typical for at least the last 20, 30 years. And then personalized power, it's my people.
Yeah.
And I do believe it's important for Erdogan, it's important for Trump, it's important for all these people who try to identify it. There is not nation in the classical sense that it was before. And for me, I'm interested to what extent you see this as also as one of the trends.
Thank you. Two great questions. So the first one, I mean, yes, the ability to create dynasties is much more limited in our time, which sounds like good news. At the same time, historically, this kind of dynastic succession, especially if it's primogeniture, created over time certain constraints on the king or the emperor, because tradition and the institutions of the crown and so on curb the strongman type of behavior. I am the founder, I'm the god, I can do whatever kind of behavior. The Mongols, who did not have this, because it wouldn't go automatically to the older son, they found a way of recreating strongman leaders because anybody who was eligible, which is members of the house, the governing house, they would fight among themselves, and then whoever won would become the next Khan or the next strongman. So it is possible to imagine scenarios where we don't have dynasties, but our system is constantly selecting strongmen, as we've seen in a number of settings. So that is, hopefully our choice is not between dynasty and the selection or reselection of strongmen. Hopefully we find a solution before then. As for the second question, I agree with you. I mean, nations and nationalism, we could say have been problematic, have been causes of wars. But at the same time, the idea of a nation, both practically for the reasons you stated, but also in principle is a check on this idea of one person having all the power, because if you serve the nation, you're not the nation is the sovereign, you cannot be the ultimate sovereign. So if nations erode, then that last check is removed from this very old kind of political problem. And we may be nostalgic for a time of nations. I mean, that's why I was talking about, the tech bros and so on. At least our strongmen still talk about nations and the nation states. Like, what happens with the next generation of strongmen who are not even paying lip service to the nation, and they're like my employers and my employees? I mean, again, fantastic. I mean, I wish it was completely fantastic. It's not, right? It's actually quite foreseeable how we go from here to there. It's just one possible future scenario that I hope we can avoid. But yeah, that is definitely the erosion of nations is definitely a contributing factor.
Well, thank you so much, Ayşe. And thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you for the great questions.